Hi there. North Korea is really weird, right? We all know this. The dear leader drinks a liter of Hennessy every day. He scored a hole-in-one on his first try and has the largest penis. He doesn't need the bathroom either, apparently. The North Korean people are all militarized fanatics. There's no fast food, the horror, or food at all for that matter. They don't know that other continents exist, and somehow all have to have Kim Jong-un's haircut, as well as not being allowed to have Kim Jong-un's haircut at all. Very curious land. Or is it? This video isn't a commentary on whether North Korea, or by its official name the DPRK, is a good or bad country, whatever those labels mean. It's more meant as a look into why the DPRK seems so weird, and if it really is weird in the first place. I mean, it really is weird, right? Talk about North Korea is repetitive and clickbaity. Surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, the vast majority of what you hear about the DPRK is nonsense. I'd probably go as far as to say that every commonly held belief about the DPRK is a known and proven fabrication. Either they're outright wrong, or they're lacking such a massive amount of nuance and context as to make them wrong. Again, this isn't commenting on the DPRK as a country, it's up to you to make your mind up on that. But when you take away all the fear-mongering and sensationalism, it seems like a normal place where normal people live normal lives. There are people who agree with the government and those that don't. There are people that love their jobs and those that hate them. There are kids that would rather play video games instead of do homework, and there are those annoying kids that remind the teacher that they weren't given homework, the fucking pricks. My point being, let's not dehumanize a place we've never been to, and people we've never spoken to, never seen, and are almost taught to instinctively hate for foreign policy agendas of governments that never gave a damn about you or I. So, how did the media create this North Korea we picture in our minds? When it comes to North Korea, the Western press gets most of its information from South Korea, and both of them have a direct stake in vilifying the DPRK. Why? Well, South Korea is still at war with the DPRK, technically. As for the Western press, ads, clicks, outrageous headlines that get people to point and laugh, things that grab the eyes, all this generates money for a dying industry struggling to hold on. It's a simple process. The DPRK is a supposedly secretive country. Of course, they have an official outlet for communicating in many languages, including English, but who has the time for that, especially since they're blocked or taken down so often in the US and other NATO countries? Since it's so secretive, you can basically report whatever, and technically it could be right. Concretely, here's what happens. A South Korean tabloid, or other non-reputable gossip media looking to sell some magazines or to get some clicks, makes up a ridiculous claim. Let's say, hypothetically, jeans are banned in North Korea. Most of the time, it's just a claim. If they're feeling generous, they'll mention an anonymous source, or misattribute the claim to a North Korean newspaper or other official organ to give it an air of legitimacy. This gets picked up by either more mainstream South Korean newspapers, or directly goes in translation to the Western press. With no research or fact-checking, they publish this widely and continue the spectacle. Sometimes they even publish a refutation of an article many months later, only to not advertise it anywhere. You can test this process yourself. Find a claim about the DPRK that looks too ridiculous to be true. Look through the sources, if they even bother referencing them, and within 2 clicks you'll reach either an anonymous source, or a claim without any sourcing at all. With the banned jeans example, they all reference other Western sources, of which only a few link to a South Korean mainstream source, which in turn references a North Korean newspaper titled Rodong Sinmun, which is misspelled as Sinmum with an M in Western sources. Only the most rigorous journalistic practices, you see. This newspaper has an English website with a searchable content filter. Looking up anything related to jeans or the supposedly quoted text from the South Korean newspaper brings up nothing. They basically just made it up. To build up from this, Bruce Cummings, an American historian, has documented South Korean intelligence agencies' long history of fabricating news and providing misinformation to foreign journalists. Lankov, an analyst and expert in the field, who is by no means a fan of the DPRK, argues that Western media actively suppresses positive news or coverage of improvements in the DPRK as well. Why, though? Simple. Because the DPRK is incredibly strategically important in location, as well as very rich in minerals. Some estimates put the worth of natural resources of the DPRK at many trillions of dollars, not a cent of which goes into the pockets of American businessmen or politicians. All of a sudden, the American pattern of impoverish a nation through sanctions, provoke war, maintain a constant state of destabilization, and then steal resources cheaply reveals itself. It's a lucrative business, especially since an anti-DPRK organization can get a grant of up to $350,000 for engaging in so-called activism against the DPRK. So let's go over some common myths. There are hundreds of ridiculous claims, and the vast majority of them have either been debunked or haven't been confirmed in any reliable way. Hilariously, there's even a Wikipedia page on how unreliable reporting on the DPRK is. When it comes to these myths, one of the most common and most ridiculous are the fake executions. After the failure of negotiations with the US in Hanoi just a couple years ago, it was widely reported that the entire negotiation team of the DPRK was executed. A few weeks later, Kim Yong-chol, the head of the team, appeared alive and well at an art performance. Ri Yong-gil, the Korean People's Army chief of staff, basically head of the army, was apparently executed in 2016, only to show up a few months later at diplomatic talks. Hyun Sung-wol, a performer and a woman widely claimed to be Kim Jong-un's former girlfriend, despite no reputable source ever being provided, at least from my research, was apparently executed by firing squad in 2013, only to reappear a few months later as well. Pretty much every single execution story goes exactly like this. It's actually pretty funny. Other claims, too, are absolutely nonsense when checked. The people are forced to cry during the passing of the former leader Kim Jong-il, too, it's a myth, as you may expect at this point. This expression of wailing and crying is a recognized and common aspect of Korean Confucian culture, and is even seen in South Korea in some instances. The Kim Jong-il scored all holes in one the first time he played golf claim, too, is something made up by an Australian journalist, and apparently North Koreans, when asked by tourists about this, give a puzzled look, which I'd pay money to see that, honestly. The very common North Korea claims to have discovered unicorns myth is, frankly, a very bad and honestly somewhat racist one to top off this list. Long story short, they never claimed they discovered a unicorn, but instead they identified an archaeological site related to the ancient capital of Korea, which has some reference to some mythical being that resembles a unicorn. The use of symbolic language was taken by the Western press without the appropriate analysis and twisted into, look at how crazy these Koreans are. It's kind of silly, honestly. Another claim, North Koreans are starving, too, is mostly a myth. There was a famine after the dissolution of the USSR and the sanctions placed on the DPRK, but this was well over 20 years ago now. Nowadays, malnutrition rates and infant mortality in the DPRK are well above the average for Asia, mostly thanks to state subsidies, good organization, and a solid public healthcare system. The famous North Korea has no light image, too, is missing context. Long story short, what you see is light distortion, as the image isn't adjusted, along with too few satellite orbits around the Earth, which is what's required to generate a bright image, which requires many dozens of passages focused around a location to receive. You can do the same with the US if you're particularly cheeky, and if you take into account the proper variables. You can get a more realistic picture of the DPRK, which looks like the amount of light given off by practically every other third world country, and, funnily enough, in part slightly better than my native Iraq. That's not to say the DPRK doesn't have electricity shortage issues, but if you've ever visited a third world country, you'd know this is a very common problem worldwide. Take a look at this video from Professor Susie Kim from Rutgers University for a deeper dive into general media representation. To drive the point home, a few years ago, a satirical video was uploaded to YouTube titled How Americans Live Today. Honestly, check it out, it's hilarious. Which was an obviously comedic video that spoke of how Americans have to queue up for cups of melted snow instead of coffee every day, and how American houses are blown over by wind, forcing them to live in tents. It's a joke, an obvious one at that. Despite it being an obvious joke uploaded by a YouTube channel mentioning the fact that it is indeed a joke, pretty much every single American news agency picked it up and claimed it was a North Korean propaganda film, with some even bringing in so-called experts to verify it as such. When it finally came out that it was indeed a joke, only a handful published corrections to their original articles. Even in highly respected and supposedly reliable journals and papers, you see the same debunked claims repeated over and over. The haircut nonsense, the fashion police, North Korean necromancy in which someone who was supposedly executed 2 weeks ago magically returns to life. It makes you wonder how people, supposedly educated in journalism, allow themselves to be this dishonest. Almost every single policy recommendation or even throwaway comment grazes either military action against the DPRK or pushing for its collapse. It makes you think, maybe the only North Korean style propaganda that truly exists is the ones we are exposed to every day. But what about defectors? I plan on making a longer video on this eventually, but yes, what about them? Don't their testimonies account for something? Well, yeah, to an extent. It would be wrong to claim everything every single defector said ever is wrong, but it's equally wrong to not mention how they all have a monetary incentive to make up as much as they can, as gruesomely as they can. Again, we live in the world of the dollar. Advertisers want things that get clicks. Defectors usually are enticed to come to South Korea, only to end up homeless or unemployed, with little economic prospects and a lot of discrimination to fight against. In these conditions, talking about how your country is generally a poor third world country with the usual third world country problems doesn't get clicks. Stories of cannibalism, fantastical executions, and your dear leader's engorged phallus do, though. Cue the ever-expanding DPRK defector cinematic universe. What starts as a few days' walk and crossing a border at night turns into a multi-month epic that takes our perilous heroes through spiraling towers, endless deserts, and impossible geometry, to quote a modern classic. Yeonmi Park is a perfect example of this. Her stories have shifted and crucial details been altered to more gruesome alternatives dozens of times now, and she's grown pretty rich doing this too. Shin Dong-hyuk, another famous defector who met with Bush and has published books since, also is notoriously known for altering many aspects of his story. So much so that his handlers, translator, and even several experts in the field all doubt his testimonies. That's not even mentioning the trafficking and targeting South Korea does on North Koreans in order to entice defections, as most defectors are motivated more by economic factors than political, and this is illustrated by their testimony and the fact that most defectors themselves are from the poorest provinces of the DPRK. A good documentary that discusses this is Loyal Citizens of Pyongyang in Seoul, in which you can get their direct thoughts on their situations. That's all well and good then, but why is North Korea so militarized? Here's where some history comes in. After the Japanese were defeated, the victorious people of Korea created their own nation, the People's Republic of Korea. This republic had many communists in its ranks, and Kim Il-sung was a recognized hero of the anti-Japanese resistance. The US didn't like this, and in its attempts to limit the spread of communism, completely dismantled all local worker and peasant organizations they found, imprisoned or killed communists, and legally declared a different republic, which became South Korea. This political jockeying resulted in a war in the early 50s in which North Korean infrastructure and agriculture was absolutely destroyed by the US. I mean, completely decimated. They lost millions, with a lot of those being civilians, and in many cities had only a single building left standing, if at all. Seeing this destruction, the US never stopped harassing them, even to this day. The US regularly flies nuclear-armed bombers through North Korean airspace, an internationally illegal and provocative move. They carry out invasion exercises right on the border and regularly sanction or attempt to limit the DPRK's ability to simply exist. Their massive military, which is only a minuscule fraction of the US's military, I might add, was a necessary protective mechanism against these provocations. Here's where nuclear weapons enter. Long story short, the DPRK developed nuclear weapons in order to reduce the burden of their large military on their budget and population, simply so the US doesn't do to the DPRK what it did to Iraq, Libya, etc. The DPRK developed nuclear weapons. They even offered to give them up in return for peace, but the US refused. To remind us of the history, though, the US agreed with Iraq and Libya to dismantle their nuclear programs, only for that to be the undoing of those relatively stable countries just a few years later, through violent NATO action, of course. Nowadays, they're failed state ruins governed by militias, and the West couldn't care less anymore. Conclusion. So if it isn't the mythical Looney Tunes meets 1984 dystopia that it's painted as, what is it? Simple. In my opinion, the DPRK isn't weird, it's a nation at war. It's fearing for its existence, and it's experienced untold misery and destruction at the hands of the US within living memory. It isn't threatening the world, it is, however, constantly threatened by the US and NATO via military exercises, an illegal violation of its airspace every single year. It's a poor third world country, with the usual third world country issues only made much, much worse by merciless sanctions and diplomatic vilification. When you take into account the relevant context, the rationale of their actions begins to show, and you see less a maniacal rogue state and more a country struggling to survive. Look up any discussion of the DPRK and you'll see a lot of propagandistic talk about how badly they're doing, without a single mention of the crushing economic sanctions that don't let them import even simple medicines, let alone anything else. Truly the epitome of shooting somebody in the leg and blaming them when they can't walk. Some recommendations I can make include some books and some documentaries. The documentaries include the aforementioned Loyal Citizens of Pyongyang in Seoul, and a great and humanizing documentary called My Brothers and Sisters in the North. A video to recommend on the early history is Relino's excellent How the US Divided Korea, which goes through the topic beautifully. As for books, I can recommend Goan's Patriots, Traitors, and Empires, which illustrates the ridiculously engaging and twisted modern history of Korea. It's definitely a must-read, absolutely. If you read anything at all on the topic, then read this book. Tim Beale's North Korea, The Struggle Against American Power is great as well. Another recommendation is the work of Bruce Cummings, and specifically his North Korea, Another Country. Lankov, too, has a decent book titled The Real North Korea, which is also worth a read. Finally, a great positive coverage article on the DPRK that I can recommend is North Korea, A Realistic Portrayal, Please. Consult the further reading section in the pinned comment for all of this.